Hey, did you know that more than 90% of our viewers listen every night but haven't subscribed yet? If you enjoy these gangster sleep stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. It's completely free and helps us keep these underworld tales alive. Now, get comfortable, unwind, and drift into tonight's story.
The night settles over the silent empires, where secrets linger and power can vanish as quietly as it arrives. Tonight, we turn to Anthony Zizzo, the elusive Chicago figure whose calm presence, deep connections, and sudden disappearance turned him into one of the underworld's quietest mysteries. His story isn't marked by noise or headlines, but by unanswered questions, whispered theories, and a silence that still hangs in the air. Before we begin, tap that like button. We're aiming for 100 likes tonight, and share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. Your support keeps these whispered stories alive in the stillness of the night. Now lean back, breathe slow, and let the story of Anthony Zizzo guide you deeper into the quiet. In the late summer of 2006, in a quiet suburb west of Chicago, a 71-year-old man walked out of his home and vanished. It was just after midday on August 31. The neighbors in Westmont, Illinois, saw nothing that suggested drama. No police sirens, no shouted arguments in the driveway, no struggle in the street. Later that day, his silver Jeep sport utility vehicle would be found abandoned in the parking lot of a restaurant in nearby Melrose Park. Keys gone, driver gone. No obvious sign of what had happened in the hours between. What looked, at first glance, like a few missing person flyers in the southwest suburbs was, in fact, the latest chapter in a very different story. The story of organized crime in Chicago. Because the man who disappeared that afternoon was not just another retiree. His name was Anthony Zizzo, known in law enforcement files and on the streets by a deceptively harmless nickname, Little Tony. Federal agents and local detectives had spent decades attaching that name to surveillance reports, wiretap transcripts, and confidential informant statements. By the time he walked to his car that day, investigators believed he had become one of the most senior figures in the Chicago outfit, the same criminal organization that had once belonged to Al Capone, now a quieter but still potent force in the underworld of the American Midwest. His disappearance immediately drew the attention of FBI squads and organized crime units, not only because a man with such a reputation was suddenly unaccounted for, but because it fit a pattern that stretched back through the history of the syndicate. Important figures, at moments of tension, simply ceased to exist in public view. To understand how someone like Anthony Zizzo ends up at the center of that kind of mystery, it is necessary to step away from the restaurant parking lot and the missing person bulletins, and go back more than 70 years, to the Chicago into which he was born. The story of his life is inseparable from the story of the city itself, a place where immigrant striving, industrial might, political corruption, and organized crime intertwined for generations. According to public records, Anthony Zizzo was born on August 3, 1935, in Chicago, Illinois, into an Italian-American family. By then, the great wave of Italian immigration that had transformed American cities at the turn of the 20th century had slowed, but its imprint on Chicago remained unmistakable. Italian enclaves on the near west side, around Taylor Street and other pockets of the city, were dense neighborhoods with churches, social clubs, corner groceries, and extended families stacked in narrow brick buildings. They were also, by this time, places where the power of established criminal groups could be felt in everything from the ownership of taverns to the allocation of city contracts. When Anthony was born, Al Capone had already been in federal prison for several years. Prohibition, which had supercharged the growth of organized crime by making alcohol illegal and therefore immensely profitable to smuggle and sell, technically ended in 1933, 2 years before his birth. But the same network of gangsters, fixers, and corrupt officials that had grown fat on bootlegging did not dissolve with the repeal of the 18th Amendment. Instead, under new leadership, the Capone mob evolved into what became known as the Chicago outfit, and it diversified, Illegal gambling, extortion, protection rackets, labor racketeering, and the infiltration of legitimate businesses all became part of its portfolio. By the late 1930s, when Anthony Zizzo was a small child, the outfit was less visible to the casual observer than it had been in Capone's time, but in many ways more powerful. That contrast between public quiet and hidden control would define the environment in which he grew up. On the surface, the world of his childhood was shaped by the same forces that touched millions of other Americans. The tail end of the Great Depression, the mobilization of World War II, and in the post-war years, the surge in industrial jobs that fueled Chicago's growth. Families in working-class neighborhoods made do with what they had. Children walked to public schools. Parish priests tried to keep youngsters connected to church life. And older generations spoke Italian or Sicilian dialects at kitchen tables crowded with relatives. For many, the path forward lay in education, factory work, military service, or trade apprenticeships. But for children in certain parts of the city, there was also another set of role models. Well-dressed men who seemed to have money when others did not, who could arrange jobs, fix traffic tickets, and mediate disputes, who were known to have friends inside City Hall and the police department. These were the street-level representatives of the outfit and related criminal groups. They often presented themselves not as predators, but as protectors of the neighborhood, of the Italian people, of local businesses. Youngsters would see them at social clubs, at weddings and funerals, at feast day processions for patron saints. The aura of power and confidence surrounding these figures was one of the subtle but pervasive facts of life in mid-century Italian Chicago. The surviving public record on Anthony Zizzo's childhood is thin. Court documents, later law enforcement reports, and newspaper accounts rarely dwell on his early years. They tell us little about his parents, his schooling, or specific adolescent experiences. In that sense, his background resembles that of many mid-level and upper-level organized crime figures. The documentation only becomes extensive once authorities view them as important enough to watch. What can be said with certainty is that he came of age in a city where the outfit was firmly entrenched, and where Italian-American neighborhoods were among its most important recruiting grounds. Chicago in the 1940s and 1950s was a place of opportunity and tension. The wartime boom and the post-war expansion of manufacturing plants and stockyards meant jobs for thousands of unskilled and semi-skilled workers. At the same time, the lines between legitimate labor power and criminal influence were often blurred. Unions could secure better wages and safer working conditions, but some locals were infiltrated or outright controlled by gangsters, who used them to skim dues, shake down employers, and control who got hired. In such an environment, a young Italian-American man who found his way into trucking, construction, or other unionized trades might discover that the same men who decided whether he worked that week also had reputations as enforcers or bookmakers. For law-abiding families, the presence of these forces could feel both threatening and unavoidable. Many wanted nothing to do with illegal activity and worked hard to keep their children on a straight path, even as they navigated the practical reality that certain favors, an expedited building permit, a job on a city crew, were easier to come by if one knew the right person. Others viewed occasional dealings with outfit figures as the cost of doing business. In later decades, when federal investigators and journalists tried to map the power structure of the syndicate, they would find its tendrils everywhere, in taverns and pizzerias, in back rooms of social clubs, and in the boards of apparently legitimate companies. Into that complex world stepped Anthony Zizzo. As he moved from childhood to adolescence in the late 1940s and early 1950s, the leadership of the outfit was undergoing its own transformation. After Capone and his immediate successors, the power center shifted toward men like Paul the Waiter, Ricca and Anthony Joe Batters Accardo. Under their guidance, the outfit adopted a lower profile and a more businesslike approach. Violence still existed and could be lethal, but it was less flamboyant. The goal was steady income, minimal publicity, and cooperative arrangements with politicians and other power brokers. During the 1950s, Sam Giancana emerged as a high-profile leader, drawing national attention, and with it, scrutiny from the FBI and congressional investigators. Through it all, the outfit's control over certain suburban municipalities, most notoriously the town of Cicero just west of Chicago, intensified. Cicero became, in effect, a company town for the Chicago outfit. Long before Zizzo's name would be associated with it, the suburb had gained a reputation as a place where outfit bosses could operate with relative freedom, thanks to corrupt local officials and sympathetic or intimidated police. Illegal casinos, backroom card games, and other rackets thrived there. The town's history with organized crime stretched back at least to the 1920s, when Capone moved his operations out of the city proper to avoid pressure from reform-minded officials. That legacy persisted. By the time Zizzo was a young man, Cicero was widely seen by investigators as the beating heart of the outfit's betting and vice empire. It is against this backdrop that Anthony Zizzo's adult life began to intersect with the law enforcement record. While precise details of his earliest jobs are scarce in open sources, later court filings and investigative reports place him firmly in the orbit of the outfit's western suburban operations. The nickname by which he would become known, Little Tony, appears in these documents and in contemporary news coverage. The moniker referred not to his influence, which agents believed grew substantial over time, but to his physical stature. He was reportedly short, stocky, and in the words of one Chicago Crime Commission profile, someone whose unassuming appearance belied his importance in the underworld. In the 1950s and early 1960s, the typical pathway for a man of Zizzo's background into the outfit followed a recognizable pattern. It seldom began with dramatic acts. Instead, young associates might start with seemingly minor tasks, relaying messages, acting as drivers, standing watch near backroom card games, collecting small debts from bookmakers' customers, or working in businesses such as bars or trucking outfits that were friendly to or controlled by the syndicate. In return, they received protection, occasional loans, and over time, the trust of older and more powerful figures. While the exact steps of Zizzo's initiation into this world are not documented in detail in public sources, by the 1960s, federal agents and local detectives were already identifying him in their internal reports as being linked to known outfit members. This was the era when the federal government began to take a more systematic interest in national organized crime. The televised Kefauver committee hearings in the early 1950s had introduced millions of Americans to the concept of a countrywide crime syndicate. By the early 1960s, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, long reluctant to acknowledge the scale of organized crime, had created the Top Hoodlum program, directing field offices to gather intelligence on key figures in each city. Chicago, with its long history and entrenched outfit structure, was a priority. Agents compiled thick files, conducted physical and electronic surveillance where they could, and recruited informants within the ranks of bookmakers, corrupt officials, and low-level associates. Names like Ricca, Accardo, and Giancana appeared at the top of these lists, but the reports also mentioned dozens of others, soldiers, collectors, and crew bosses who handled daily operations in neighborhoods and suburbs. It was in this layer of the underworld hierarchy that Anthony Zizzo began to attract sustained attention. By the mid-1960s, according to later law enforcement testimony and organized crime digests, he was regarded not merely as a hanger-on, but as someone who had earned real responsibility. This did not yet make him a household name, even within Chicago. The outfit valued discretion, Many of its most effective operatives remained unknown to the wider public for years, their names surfacing only in court cases or Senate hearings. But within the world of investigators, Zizzo was noted, his file updated as agents cross-referenced phone taps, informant statements, and observed meetings in restaurants and social clubs. For communities in which the outfit operated, the growing stature of men like Zizzo had concrete consequences. Illegal gambling and loan sharking might have been seen by some customers as victimless or even benign, especially when compared to the lurid gang wars of earlier decades. But they created quiet, enduring harm. Families could be dragged under by debts. Small businesses were pressured to pay for protection. Union locals were steered toward contracts that benefited syndicate-backed firms. Chicago newspapers occasionally reported on raids of backroom casinos or on the arrests of low-level operatives, but the larger system remained largely out of sight. In this climate, Anthony Zizzo began to build the reputation that would shadow him for the rest of his life. Law enforcement accounts portray him as a loyal, steady figure within the outfit structure, someone who stayed out of tabloids and avoided flamboyant gestures. This approach fit the post-Capone ethos of the organization, which prized money over publicity and preferred threats, influence, and selective examples of force to the kind of open warfare that drew intense police reaction. Keeping a low profile did not mean that the stakes were low. Rather, it reflected a conscious strategy to preserve the revenue streams and political arrangements that made the outfit so durable. By the end of the 1960s, the boy born into a modest Italian-American family in Depression-era Chicago had become, in the eyes of federal agents and local organized crime units, a trusted participant in one of the country's most entrenched criminal enterprises. The path from childhood to that position had been shaped as much by the structures around him, the legacy of prohibition, the hardening of outfit control in suburbs like Cicero, the blurred lines between legitimate and illegitimate power, as by any individual choice. The next chapters of his life would see him collide more directly with the courts, with federal racketeering laws, and with the internal tensions of the outfit itself, as the quiet man known as Little Tony navigated a world where loyalty, money, and fear were constantly in play. By the early 1970s, the name Anthony "Little Tony" Zizzo had become familiar to a relatively small circle of people who paid close attention to organized crime in Chicago. They were not neighborhood gossip mongers or local reporters. Those circles still rarely mentioned him, but rather detectives in vice units, analysts at the FBI field office on Roosevelt Road, and attorneys in the U.S. Attorney's Office who specialized in racketeering. In their internal memoranda, his name appeared alongside others connected to the outfit's western suburban operations, particularly in and around Cicero, and the adjacent communities that formed a kind of protective ring around Chicago's city limits. The world in which Zizzo was now operating as an adult had changed drastically from the one into which he had been born. Post-war prosperity had initially bolstered neighborhoods like those on Chicago's Near West Side, but by the late 1960s and early 1970s, deindustrialization and suburban flight were redrawing the city's economic map. Factories closed or relocated. White ethnic families moved to bungalows and ranch houses in suburbs that were steadily expanding along new expressways, and long-standing urban enclaves shifted as new immigrant and migrant groups arrived. For the outfit, this upheaval was both a challenge and an opportunity. Some of their traditional revenue streams, such as certain tavern-based gambling operations, had to adapt, but their ability to insinuate themselves into suburban construction, waste hauling, and entertainment industries opened fresh possibilities. Cicero, where Zizzo would eventually be regarded by investigators as a central figure, stood at the heart of these new dynamics. It was a blue-collar suburb with a long history of being receptive to outfit influence, whether through outright corruption or through the quieter pressures that came with decades of entanglement. To federal agents compiling organizational charts in the 1970s, Cicero was not just another suburb, it was a strategic stronghold. Illegal casinos, sports betting operations, and loan sharking crews were believed to operate there with the blessing and oversight of senior bosses whose names were well known in law enforcement circles. Joseph Ayuppa, Jackie Saron, and others who had risen under the tutelage of Tony Accardo. In that environment, men like Anthony Zizzo served as crucial intermediaries. The outfit's leadership rarely dealt directly with every bookmaker or bar owner who owed them a cut. Instead, they relied on trusted lieutenants and crew bosses to manage day-to-day activities, settle disputes, collect money, and ensure that lower-level associates stayed in line. Law enforcement sources from the period would later describe Zizzo as one of those trusted lieutenants. He was, according to these accounts, not someone who sought limelight or cultivated a flamboyant persona. Unlike some earlier generations of gangsters who wound up in gossip columns and nightclub photographs, Zizzo maintained a comparatively low profile, a trait that likely helped him endure through repeated waves of police crackdowns. The work of a mid-level outfit operative in those years was, in many ways, more mundane than Hollywood depictions of organized crime suggested. Investigators who mapped these operations described a network of phone calls, quiet meetings in coffee shops and restaurant back rooms, and the steady, unglamorous work of managing an illicit cash flow. Illegal card games needed locations and dealers, sports bettors needed lines and credit, bar and restaurant owners who agreed, willingly or under pressure, to host video poker machines or other gambling equipment needed regular servicing and collections. In addition, there was the realm of so-called juice loans, high interest, often illegal loans extended to individuals or small businesses who could not or would not go through banks. Collecting on these obligations was a significant part of the outfit's business in the 1970s and 1980s. Although surviving public records do not provide a detailed, day-by-day account of Zizzo's role in this ecosystem, internal government files, later court testimony, and reporting by crime commissions and journalists consistently place him in this orbit. Surveillance teams noted his presence at meetings with known outfit figures. Confidential informants identified him as someone with authority in Cicero-based operations. These sources, inevitably imperfect and sometimes conflicting, helped shape the picture that took hold within the FBI and among federal prosecutors. Zizzo was considered a reliable, quietly influential player in the outfit's western suburban apparatus. The legal landscape in which he operated was also changing. In 1970, Congress had passed the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, creating powerful new tools for prosecutors. RICO allowed them to charge individuals not just for isolated criminal acts, but for their roles in broader enterprises engaged in a pattern of racketeering activity. In practice, this meant that instead of prosecuting a bookmaker for a single illegal wager or a collector for a single extortionate demand, the government could try to demonstrate that these acts were part of an ongoing criminal organization's business model. For men like Zizzo, who were suspected of having supervisory roles within such organizations, RICO raised the stakes significantly. Throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s, federal strike forces made repeated efforts to apply these new laws to the Chicago outfit. High-profile cases targeted top bosses involved in Las Vegas casino skimming, as well as local leaders who oversaw gambling, loan sharking, and labor racketeering in Chicago and its suburbs. Some of the most prominent figures, Ayuppa, Saron, and others, would eventually be convicted in major federal prosecutions, serving long prison terms. These cases underscored for the outfit that the era of nearly untouchable leadership was over. They responded by adapting, decentralizing some operations, and in certain instances elevating lower-profile figures who they believed could manage affairs with less attention from the press and the public. Anthony Zizzo's reputation, as captured in law enforcement summaries, grew in this atmosphere. By the 1980s, he was frequently named in reports as a Cicero-based operative with influence over gambling and related rackets. The Chicago Crime Commission, a long-standing civic watchdog group that tracked organized crime, would eventually list him as a key figure in the outfit hierarchy, though during those years their public bulletins mentioned him less often than more notorious names. Within the justice system, however, his profile was high enough that federal agents considered him worth following. They watched who he met, what cars he drove, which restaurants he favored. On occasion, they tried to flip people in his circle, low-level bookmakers, drivers, or business owners, hoping to gain insight into his activities and relationships. For the communities where these activities were concentrated, the presence of Zizzo and others like him had tangible effects. In Cicero and neighboring suburbs, the outfit's influence shaped local economies in ways that were not always immediately visible, but could be deeply corrosive over time. A bar owner who agreed to host illegal gambling machines might find that he was now reliant on the outfit not only for the machines themselves, but for the additional customers they attracted. A small contractor who accepted an introduction to secure a municipal job could later discover that he was expected to steer business to certain suppliers. Local politics, too, were vulnerable. Town officials who cooperated with or turned a blind eye to outfit-linked schemes could prolong their own careers, but at a cost to public accountability and financial integrity. While many residents went about their lives with little direct contact with organized crime, others encountered it in more personal ways. A relative who fell into debt with a bookmaker. A neighbor who had to close a business after being unable to keep up with payments. A worker whose union pension fund was put at risk by corrupt investments. For law-abiding families of Italian descent in these areas, the persistence of the outfit and its influence was a source of frustration, and at times, stigma. Community leaders and clergy often spoke out against the lure of easy money and the false glamour associated with organized crime, emphasizing that most Italian Americans worked hard in legitimate jobs and wanted nothing to do with the syndicate. Yet the continued existence of figures like Zizzo created a shadow that was hard to dispel. By the late 1980s, the balance of power within the outfit had again shifted. Some earlier bosses were now behind bars or had retreated from visible leadership roles. Newer figures with deep roots in the western suburbs came to the fore. It was during this period, according to federal authorities, that Zizzo's standing particularly solidified. Internal FBI assessments portrayed him as part of the leadership structure that managed daily operations in Cicero, operations that investigators believed generated substantial illicit revenue through gambling, extortion, and the infiltration of local businesses. Though he rarely appeared in front-page headlines at that time, those who specialized in tracking the outfit increasingly treated him as a central character in its ongoing story. It was also around this time that Zizzo's activities drew serious attention from federal prosecutors outside of Illinois. In the early 1990s, investigators in Nevada and elsewhere pursued cases that focused on the influence of Midwestern crime families, Chicago among them, over illegal gambling and extortion in and around Las Vegas. News reports from that period, as well as later summaries by crime commissions and law enforcement agencies, describe a federal racketeering case in which Zizzo was charged alongside other defendants. The indictment alleged that they had overseen illegal bookmaking operations and extortionate collections tied to gambling debts, part of a broader attempt by Midwestern syndicates to profit from Las Vegas's gaming culture beyond the highly regulated, legitimate casinos. Court records and contemporary reporting indicate that Zizzo ultimately entered a guilty plea in connection with this case, acknowledging his role in a conspiracy involving racketeering activities. The charges focused on illegal gambling and the collection of debts through intimidation, not on any specific acts of physical violence. Still, the conviction was significant. It represented a rare instance in which a man long known to law enforcement, chiefly through surveillance and informant reports, formally admitted, in a federal courtroom, to participation in organized criminal conduct. The sentence that followed sent him to federal prison for a period of years, marking the most serious legal consequence he had faced up to that point. For prosecutors and agents who had spent much of their careers watching the outfit often evade meaningful punishment, convictions like this were a measure of success. They demonstrated that RICO and related statutes could reach beyond the highest profile bosses and impose real penalties on those who ran regional operations. For communities affected by the outfit's activities, the case was a reminder that the quiet corridors of power in organized crime were being scrutinized, even if the names of those involved were not as immediately recognizable as those of earlier eras. From Zizzo's perspective, the conviction and prison term represented a sharp shift in circumstances. A man who had long managed to avoid lengthy incarceration now found himself in the federal system, reflecting on a career that had unfolded largely in the shadows. Prison, for someone in his position, was not necessarily the end of influence. Organized crime figures have often continued to direct, or at least influence operations from behind bars, communicating through intermediaries and coded messages. But it did remove him, for a time, from the daily rhythms of Cicero and the face-to-face interactions that had defined his role. During his incarceration, the world outside continued to change. The 1990s saw new pressures on traditional organized crime. Globalization altered drug markets and financial flows. Law enforcement agencies grew more sophisticated in electronic surveillance, and public tolerance for entrenched corruption in municipal governments waned as a series of scandals came to light. Within the Chicago outfit, these forces combined with internal generational shifts. Younger figures, often relatives or proteges of older bosses, began to assert themselves. Alliances were re-examined, revenue streams re-evaluated, and long-standing arrangements with corrupt officials in various suburbs came under fresh scrutiny. When Zizzo completed his federal sentence and returned to the Chicago area, he re-entered an underworld that had been altered but not dismantled. The outfit was still present in Cicero and other suburbs. Illegal gambling, loan sharking, and schemes targeting local governments and businesses had not vanished. Yet there was a greater sense of vulnerability. The federal government had shown that it could successfully prosecute not only the most famous bosses, but also those who ran key regional crews. Surveillance technology had advanced. Some former insiders had become cooperating witnesses, providing detailed accounts of the outfit's inner workings in exchange for reduced sentences or protection. Despite these changes, law enforcement assessments from the late 1990s and early 2000s consistently indicated that Zizzo resumed an important role. The Chicago Crime Commission and FBI sources described him as a high-ranking member of the outfit, often using terms like street boss or underboss to convey his influence over Cicero area operations under the broader leadership of figures such as James, Little Jimmy Marcello. These descriptions, drawn from informant reports, surveillance, and analysis of meeting patterns, suggested that Zizzo's federal conviction had not permanently diminished his stature within the organization. Instead, his willingness to plead guilty and serve time may even have reinforced, in the eyes of some within the outfit, his reliability and resolve. For the citizens of the western suburbs, the continued presence of such a figure underscored an uncomfortable reality. Even at the turn of the 21st century, when much of the public thought of the mob as the stuff of old movies, organized crime remained an active force in certain corners of Chicagoland. It might not command the nightly news in the way it had in the eras of Capone or Giancana, but its influence could be seen in subtler patterns, in who won particular municipal contracts, in which bars and restaurants quietly hosted backroom betting, and in how some labor disputes were resolved or avoided. Against this landscape, the story of Anthony "Little Tony" Zizzo's life unfolded not as a series of glamorous escapades, but as an example of long-term entrenchment in a system that had learned to survive under pressure. From his early years in Italian-American neighborhoods to his rise as a figure of interest in Cicero, through his conviction in a federal racketeering case and his return to the streets, his path mirrored the trajectory of the outfit itself, less visible than in the past, more cautious in its public posture, but still deeply woven into certain economic and political structures. The next phase of his story would draw him even more directly into the crosshairs of a resurgent federal campaign against the outfit's leadership, and ultimately into the mystery that would define his name in the broader public imagination. When Anthony "Little Tony" Zizzo walked out of federal prison in the mid-1990s, he re-entered a Chicago that had changed in ways both obvious and subtle. The steel mills and vast stockyards that had defined the city's working-class identity were mostly gone or downsized. The Loop skyline bristled with new office towers, and once rough neighborhoods near downtown were beginning to gentrify. To many residents, the mob was a fading relic, something their parents or grandparents might have whispered about in connection with prohibition, jukeboxes, and smoky backroom card games. Yet for federal agents and local detectives who had tracked Zizzo for decades, his release marked not the end of a story, but the continuation of one. Publicly available records show that after serving his federal sentence for racketeering and extortion conspiracy related to illegal gambling, Zizzo settled with his wife in Westmont, a relatively quiet suburb west of Chicago. The town was a typical slice of late 20th century suburbia: modest homes, small shopping centers, well-kept lawns. Neighbors who later spoke to reporters described him, with some surprise, as a reserved older man who did yard work, exchanged pleasantries, and did not draw attention to himself. There were no luxury cars parading in and out of the driveway, no rowdy late-night gatherings. To someone passing down his street, he could have been any other retiree. Behind that ordinary exterior, however, law enforcement agencies believed that Zizzo resumed a central role in the Chicago outfit's operations. As with much of his life, the clearest window into this period comes not from personal letters or interviews, but from government documents, FBI affidavits, Chicago Crime Commission profiles, and the testimony of informants and cooperating witnesses in related cases. These sources, taken together, depict a man who, despite his age, remained deeply involved in the business of an organization that had learned over decades how to survive pressure and adapt to new conditions. In the years after his release, FBI surveillance teams documented Zizzo meeting repeatedly with known figures in the outfit's hierarchy. They saw him in restaurant parking lots in Cicero and neighboring suburbs, in coffee shops where older Italian men lingered over espresso, and outside inconspicuous storefronts that, to an untrained eye, appeared to be nothing more than small offices or social clubs. Agents noted the license plates of cars clustered around these locations and checked them against databases of known associates. They logged dates and times, building timelines of who met whom and how often. Many of these meetings were short and seemingly informal, just a few minutes of conversation by a car door, a handshake, a shared cigarette. Yet in the cumulative view of investigators, they formed a pattern consistent with the way the outfit's leadership conducted its business. By this point, the Chicago outfit had become notably less flashy than in its mid-century heyday. Instead of running open casinos in suburban ballrooms or flaunting nightclub ownership downtown, it focused on quieter but steady revenue streams. Illegal sports betting, video poker, and other gambling devices placed in bars and restaurants, loan sharking, and control over certain local labor unions and municipal contracts. Cicero, where Zizzo's name most often appeared in investigative summaries, remained a key hub. Though the town's political leadership had changed over the decades, the stigma of long-term criminal entanglement lingered. Federal and state probes periodically exposed schemes involving town contracts, building inspections, and licensing, some of which overlapped with individuals the FBI associated with the outfit. According to multiple law enforcement assessments during this period, Zizzo was regarded as one of the outfit's primary overseers in Cicero and the western suburbs. Some described him as a street boss, a term used inside organized crime investigations to denote the person who manages the day-to-day affairs of an area on behalf of higher leadership. Others went further, suggesting he functioned as an underboss, a second-in-command role for the broader outfit under the overall direction of James "Little Jimmy" Marcello. These characterizations were based on informant statements, surveillance, and analysis of organizational behavior rather than on any formal admission by Zizzo, who never publicly embraced such titles. In court proceedings and in his limited interactions with the press through attorneys, he consistently maintained his innocence of ongoing criminal activity beyond the case for which he had already served time. The conditions of his supervised release after prison added another layer of complexity. Like many federal defendants, Zizzo was barred from associating with convicted felons or known organized crime figures as a condition of his freedom. Agents who had spent years watching outfit leadership knew that such conditions were often ignored in practice, but they also recognized that documented violations could be used to haul a defendant back before a judge, potentially sending him back to prison. As a result, some of the FBI's post-release surveillance of Zizzo served a dual purpose. It advanced their understanding of outfit networks, and it created a record that could, if necessary, support allegations that he was flouting the terms of his release. The pattern that emerged in these years was not one of spectacular confrontations with law enforcement, but of steady, low-profile contact. Zizzo was occasionally stopped and questioned by agents or detectives, routine encounters in organized crime investigations, where officers use traffic stops or casual interviews to signal that someone is under observation. According to reporting by Chicago newspapers and Crime Commission digests, he did not respond to these moments with outbursts or theatrics. Instead, he largely kept his own counsel, speaking through his attorney when necessary and otherwise allowing his silence to serve as his primary defense. For the communities where the outfit operated, his renewed prominence had implications that were less visible than a headline-grabbing raid but significant over time. Illegal sports betting continued to thrive in bars and social clubs, especially around big sporting events. Video poker machines, technically regulated under state law but widely abused, appeared in establishments where, according to investigators, a portion of the proceeds flowed not just to the bar owners, but to outfit-linked intermediaries. Loan sharking, offering high-interest credit outside the formal banking system, remained a source of quiet suffering for individuals who fell behind on payments. The persistence of these activities, in an era when many residents assumed organized crime had been largely defeated, underscored how deep its roots remained. While Zizzo maneuvered within this changing landscape, a separate and potentially more dangerous storm was gathering, a major federal investigation that would become known publicly as Operation Family Secrets. Its origins stretched back to the late 1990s, when an estranged son of a longtime outfit hitman wrote a letter from prison to the FBI, offering information in exchange for a chance to leave the life he had grown up in. That son, Frank Calabrese Jr., would later detail years of conversations with his father, Frank Calabrese Sr., about unsolved killings and the internal workings of the outfit. His cooperation, in turn, led investigators to another pivotal insider, Nicholas Calabrese, Frank Sr., brother and a man the government would later describe as the first made member of the Chicago outfit ever to become a cooperating witness. Over several years, federal agents and prosecutors painstakingly corroborated the information they received from the Calabreses and other sources. They compared accounts of murders with old police reports, crime scene photographs, and forensic evidence. They cross-checked recollections of meetings and leadership decisions with surveillance logs and wiretap transcripts. The result, in 2005, was one of the most sweeping organized crime indictments in Chicago history. The family secrets case charged multiple defendants, notably including James Marcello, Frank Calabrese Sr., Joseph, Joey the Clown Lombardo, and others, with a racketeering conspiracy that encompassed 18 previously unsolved homicides, as well as long-running schemes involving extortion, illegal gambling, and labor corruption. Zizzo was not among those indicted in the family secrets racketeering case, but his name appeared repeatedly in the background. In pretrial filings and in the testimony of cooperating witnesses, prosecutors described the structure of the outfit, administration, its leadership core during the years covered by the indictment. In those descriptions, they often placed Zizzo near the top of the hierarchy, using terms like underboss or street boss to explain his alleged role beneath Marcello. FBI agents testified in hearings that, according to their intelligence, he oversaw Cicero-based crews, coordinated gambling operations, and helped relay orders from the outfit's top leadership to lower-level figures. These characterizations did more than simply explain organizational charts to a jury. They also reinforced, in the public record, the view that by the early 2000s, Anthony "Little Tony" Zizzo was one of the most important figures still on the street in the outfit's modern incarnation. Chicago newspapers and television stations covering the family secrets case began to mention his name more frequently, often in the same breath as the men actually sitting at the defense tables. Crime reporters consulted longtime organized crime investigators who spoke, usually without attribution, about Zizzo as a key Cicero power. For viewers used to associating the mob with sepia-toned photographs of Al Capone, seeing an older, largely unknown figure like Zizzo described as part of the current leadership underscored how long the organization had persisted. Inside the outfit, the emergence of such a sweeping federal case almost certainly generated anxiety and suspicion, although the inner conversations of that world remain largely hidden. Organized crime groups under pressure from major prosecutions often face questions about who might be cooperating with authorities and how much information has already been surrendered. Trust, always precious in such circles, becomes even more fragile when longtime insiders are testifying in open court about past crimes and the identities of participants. While there is no direct evidence in the public record that Zizzo was accused internally of cooperation at this stage, investigators and journalists alike have noted that the family secrets case increased tensions within the outfit more broadly. The case demonstrated that even families and brothers could turn on each other when facing long sentences, a reality that weighed on anyone involved in the organization. Around the same time, Zizzo's life in Westmont appeared, at least outwardly, to remain steady. Neighbors recalled later that he kept regular habits, leaving the house at certain times of day, returning in the evening, sometimes driving to familiar haunts in the western suburbs. His wife maintained their home, and the couple appeared from the outside to live modestly. There were no obvious signs of affluence that might have matched newspaper descriptions of him as a high-ranking organized crime figure. This contrast between the mundane rhythms of suburban life and the dramatic language of federal affidavits highlighted a recurring theme in modern organized crime. Its leaders learned to blend in, to avoid the ostentation that once made their predecessors easy targets for investigators and tax authorities alike. For law enforcement, however, Zizzo remained anything but inconspicuous. The FBI's organized crime squad in Chicago continued to gather intelligence on his movements and meetings. Some of this work was tied directly to the family secrets case, as agents tried to understand how other outfit figures were responding to the indictments and whether they were attempting to interfere with witnesses or destroy evidence. Other aspects of the surveillance were part of a longer-term effort to build separate cases focused on gambling, extortion, or labor corruption. In the world of organized crime investigations, it was common for different squads and prosecutors to pursue overlapping but distinct targets. A man like Zizzo could be of interest to several ongoing probes at once. By the mid-2000s, as pretrial motions and hearings in the family secrets case played out in federal court, Zizzo was in his early 70s. Age did not, in the view of agents who tracked him, diminish his significance. If anything, his longevity within the outfit structure made him more central. He was part of a shrinking circle of men who had come of age when the organization's influence was at its height, and who had managed to navigate multiple waves of crackdowns without being permanently removed from the streets. This made him, in the eyes of the FBI, a valuable source of continuity and knowledge, someone who understood historical arrangements with local governments and unions, who knew where money flowed, and who had long-standing personal ties to other senior figures. From the perspective of his family and immediate social circle, however, he may have appeared simply as an aging husband, relative, or friend who happened to have a criminal record in his past. Family members of organized crime figures have often spoken, in other contexts, about the gap between public portrayals and private reality. How a man who is described in court as a ruthless operator can also be remembered at home as quiet, strict, or even protective. In Zizzo's case, his relatives maintained after his disappearance that he was a devoted family man who had left his old life behind. Prosecutors and agents strongly disagreed with that assessment, but their evidence of his ongoing role relied largely on intelligence and informant testimony rather than on fresh convictions. The gulf between those competing narratives would become even more pronounced as the decade wore on. On one side stood law enforcement officials who saw in Anthony "Little Tony" Zizzo a linchpin of the outfit's modern administration, a man whose quiet demeanor masked a lifetime's knowledge of illicit enterprise. On the other stood a private circle who, whatever they knew or believed about his past, insisted on his humanity and the ordinariness of his domestic life. The collision of those images, shadowy power broker and unassuming suburban elder, set the stage for the final, unresolved chapter of his story. At a moment when federal pressure on the outfit was reaching its highest point in years, and the boundaries between loyalty, fear, and survival were being tested across the organization. On the morning of August 31, 2006, Anthony "Little Tony" Zizzo began his day in Westmont much as he had on countless other days. He was 71 years old, living in a modest 2-story house on a quiet residential street with his wife, far removed in appearance from the smoky Cicero storefronts and restaurant back rooms that had defined the public's idea of the outfit. Westmont was the kind of place where children rode bicycles in cul-de-sacs and commuters took the metro into the city. Neighbors later told reporters that they saw nothing unusual that morning. No argument in the driveway, no unfamiliar cars parked for hours at the curb, no sign that anything about that Thursday would be different. Sometime late in the morning, Zizzo left the house. Public accounts based on police reports and later FBI statements put the time at around 10:45. He was driving a silver Jeep Sport utility vehicle, a late model car that fit comfortably in the landscape of the western suburbs. Before he walked out, he reportedly told his wife he had a meeting, business of some kind, but did not specify with whom. For a man whose name had appeared in FBI surveillance logs for decades, a vague reference to a meeting was not unusual. He had spent years conducting his affairs in ways that, from the outside, often looked like a string of impromptu conversations and quiet rendezvous. What happened between the moment he backed the Jeep out of the driveway and the time the vehicle was discovered hours later remains unknown. According to law enforcement records and media reports, the Jeep turned up that same day in the parking lot of a restaurant in Melrose Park, a near western suburb with its own long history of outfit-linked activity. The lot sat near a busy thoroughfare lined with strip malls, small eateries, and automotive shops, an unremarkable place for a car to sit for a few hours without attracting attention. When officers eventually examined the vehicle, they found no obvious signs of a struggle. The keys were gone. Zizzo was gone. There was nothing inside that clearly explained why the car had been left there, who had driven it, or where its owner had gone next. At first, the absence did not trigger alarm beyond his immediate household. Adults, even elderly ones, sometimes stay out longer than planned, fall ill and seek help, or decide for their own reasons to go somewhere without immediately telling anyone. But as the afternoon turned into evening and then into night, with no phone call and no sign of his return, concern grew. By the next day, when it was clear that he had not been in touch with any relatives or friends, his family contacted the authorities to report him missing. Westmont police officers took the report and began the standard steps, checking hospitals and local jails, speaking with neighbors, documenting his last known movements. Those procedures would have been followed for any missing senior citizen. But in this case, when the name on the report circulated beyond the local station to regional and federal databases, the reaction changed. To the FBI's organized crime squad in Chicago, Anthony Zizzo was not just another name. For years, their internal documents had identified him as a high-ranking member of the Chicago outfit, someone they believed occupied a top position in the Cicero-based arm of the syndicate. His recent history included a federal racketeering conviction. His recent present included regular sightings at gatherings of known outfit figures. Within days of the initial missing persons report, the Bureau opened a parallel investigation, treating his disappearance as a case of suspected foul play. From the beginning, investigators and reporters alike noted the timing. Zizzo vanished in the final run-up to the family secrets trial, the most significant racketeering case against the outfit in a generation. The indictment in that case, unsealed in 2005, had charged major bosses and enforcers with a decades-long conspiracy that included 18 killings, extensive illegal gambling, and systemic extortion. Although Zizzo himself was not named as a defendant, federal agents had publicly linked him to the outfit's modern leadership in documents filed in connection with the case. They portrayed him as a trusted deputy of James Marcello, the man prosecutors cast as the contemporary head of the Chicago outfit. In that context, a sudden disappearance was highly unlikely to be treated as coincidence. The investigation into his absence proceeded on two parallel tracks: the ordinary mechanics of a missing person case and the more specialized lens of organized crime intelligence. Westmont police handled the local canvass. They interviewed neighbors who might have seen anything unusual that day. They retraced the route he was likely to have taken out of town. They checked security cameras at gas stations and businesses, though in 2006, suburban surveillance systems were far less ubiquitous and networked than they would be a decade later. The FBI, for its part, focused on patterns in the world Zizzo was believed to inhabit, who he had met with in the preceding weeks, whether any of those individuals had been under surveillance, whether informants had heard whispers of pending violence or internal disputes. Public details about the FBI's early findings are limited, as much of their organized crime work remained sealed or redacted. What is known is that, from early on, federal authorities told the press they believed Zizzo had been the victim of foul play. This was not based on a crime scene. The abandoned Jeep did not contain clear forensic evidence of violence, but on the totality of circumstances: his status within the outfit, the lack of contact with family, the absence of any activity on his financial accounts, and his age. A 71-year-old man with long-standing ties to a tightly knit criminal organization does not simply walk away and start a new life under a different name. Nor, agents argued, was there any indication that he had been planning to flee law enforcement. He had not been charged in the family secrets case, and prosecutors later stated publicly that he was not known to be a cooperating witness. These assurances did little to quiet speculation. In Chicago's crime reporting circles and among those who followed mob history, theories proliferated. Some observers suggested he might have been targeted by rivals within the outfit who feared he could become an informant in future cases, even if he was not currently cooperating. Others posited that a business dispute over gambling territories, unpaid debts, or the distribution of illicit revenue could have turned deadly. Still others wondered if his disappearance was connected to older, unresolved tensions dating back to his 1990s conviction or earlier, when alliances and resentments had been reshuffled by prison terms and leadership changes. None of these hypotheses, however, could be substantiated in court. No one was charged in connection with his disappearance, and investigators did not publicly name any suspects. For his family, the experience unfolded not as an abstract exercise in underworld speculation, but as an abrupt personal loss with no closure. Reporters who spoke with his wife and stepdaughter in the weeks and months following the disappearance encountered a portrait different from the one painted in FBI affidavits. To them, he was a quiet man who tended his yard, watched television, and shared meals at home. They acknowledged his prior conviction, impossible to deny in the age of searchable court records, but they insisted he had left that life behind. His stepdaughter emphasized in interviews that he was a caring presence in the household, not the hard-edged figure implied by his associations in organized crime dossiers. Their appeals for information were heartfelt and direct. Whatever his past, he was now an elderly husband and relative who had vanished without a trace. This conflict between public image and private memory is a recurrent theme in the histories of organized crime figures. Law enforcement narratives built from surveillance reports, informant statements, and intercepted communications inevitably emphasize power, influence, and alleged wrongdoing. Family narratives, rooted in daily domestic life, focus on personal traits, kindness, temper, reliability, and shared experiences. In Zizzo's case, those competing stories ran in parallel, circling around the same man but rarely intersecting. Neighbors, hearing national news describe their missing neighbor as a reputed mob underboss, expressed surprise. They spoke of a man who, while not especially sociable, kept his property neat and offered the occasional wave across the lawn. As weeks turned into months with no sign of him, the search broadened. Missing person flyers bearing his photograph and physical description circulated in the Chicago area and beyond. The FBI announced a reward for information leading to the resolution of his case, an acknowledgement that, despite their suspicions about organized crime involvement, they had no hard evidence pointing to where he might be. Divers checked bodies of water where, in other cases, vehicles or remains had been found, though there is no public record of any significant discoveries linked to the Zizzo case. Tips came in, as they do in all high-profile disappearances, but none were made public as credible breakthroughs. The historical backdrop made the silence particularly ominous. In Chicago's organized crime history, unexplained disappearances had often signaled internal discipline or retaliation. Over the decades, associates who were suspected of disloyalty, who accumulated problematic debts, or who were perceived as threats to leadership had on occasion simply stopped appearing at the usual haunts. Some of those men were later found deceased, others were never recovered. Law enforcement officials, familiar with this pattern, openly drew parallels. Without alleging specific perpetrators, they told reporters that, based on their experience, a figure of Zizzo's stature who vanished so completely was unlikely to have done so willingly. The family secrets trial, which began in federal court in Chicago in the summer of 2007, unfolded against this backdrop. As prosecutors methodically laid out decades of outfit history, explaining to jurors how the organization functioned, how decisions were made, how money flowed, names like Anthony Zizzo surfaced not as defendants but as reference points in a larger structure. Cooperating witness Nicholas Calabrese, in particular, described the hierarchy and geography of the outfit as he had experienced it, the roles played by bosses, underbosses, and street bosses, the importance of Cicero and other suburbs, the shifting alliances over time. In that narrative, Zizzo appeared as one of the men understood within the organization to hold significant authority in Cicero during certain periods. News accounts of the trial thus bound his name more firmly in the public mind to the enduring reality of the outfit. Articles and television segments explaining the case to general audiences often included sidebars or brief profiles of other reputed leaders not on trial, among them Zizzo. He was usually shown in grainy surveillance photographs, exiting restaurants or walking in parking lots, or in mugshots taken years earlier. The contrast between these images and the more recent one on his missing person flyer, a white-haired man in his 70s with glasses and a lined face, was striking. It conveyed visually what the trial testimony was describing verbally, a criminal organization whose leaders had aged along with the city, but whose structures remained recognizable to those who had studied it for decades. The verdicts in the family secrets case, delivered in September 2007, found the principal defendants guilty of racketeering and related charges. Jurors accepted prosecutors' arguments that the outfit had functioned for years as an enduring criminal enterprise, ordering and carrying out homicides and other crimes to protect its economic interests and enforce internal discipline. For agents who had spent their careers building toward such a comprehensive case, the convictions were a career-defining moment. Yet, in the months after the trial, as they looked at the broader landscape of the outfit, certain absences loomed as large as the guilty verdicts. One was the inevitable generational turnover at the top of the organization. Another was the unresolved status of Anthony "Little Tony" Zizzo. In official terms, his case remained and remains a missing person investigation. The FBI classified him as missing and possibly endangered, and his file stayed open. Without a body, without a crime scene, and without reliable eyewitness accounts, charging anyone with a crime related to his disappearance was extraordinarily difficult. Investigators could suspect, extrapolate, and drawing on long experience, outline plausible scenarios. They could compare his case to others in which high-ranking organized crime figures had been eliminated without leaving traces. But the threshold for filing charges in federal court requires evidence that can withstand cross-examination and reasonable doubt, not just pattern recognition and institutional memory. For Zizzo's relatives, the passing years were marked by the same uncertainty that haunts families in every unsolved disappearance: the lack of answers to fundamental questions about what happened and why. Unlike the families of some outfit victims whose remains were eventually found, and whose killers were identified in later prosecutions, they had no specific site to visit, no court record assigning responsibility. Their public statements, when they chose to speak, emphasized this personal dimension. They expressed frustration that media accounts rarely dwelled on the emotional toll of not knowing, focusing instead on his alleged status in the mob. At the same time, they recognized that his long association with men now convicted of serious federal crimes inevitably shaped how authorities and the public understood his case. Among law enforcement veterans, Zizzo's disappearance came to symbolize both the strengths and the limits of their efforts against the outfit. On one hand, the family secrets case and related prosecutions had dismantled much of the organization's visible leadership, sent key players to prison, and publicly documented a history of violence and extortion that officials hoped would deter future recruitment. On the other hand, the very fact that a figure as prominent in their internal charts as Zizzo could disappear without resolution underscored the enduring code of silence that protected the outfit's deeper secrets. Even with cooperative witnesses, even with decades of accumulated intelligence, there remained corners of the organization's history that outsiders could not fully illuminate. In the Chicago area, the story of Anthony "Little Tony" Zizzo thus settled into a peculiar place in the popular imagination. He was neither as infamous as earlier mobsters whose names had become shorthand for an era, nor as anonymous as the many lower-level associates who passed through the outfit's orbit without public notice. Instead, he occupied a middle ground, a man whose life traced the organization's evolution from the post-Capone years into the 21st century, and whose unexplained disappearance at the age of 71 raised questions that touched on both his personal choices and the larger world to which he had devoted much of his adult life. The outlines of his story were, by now, relatively clear. An Italian-American boy from Chicago growing into a trusted operative in Cicero, a federal conviction that sent him to prison and then back out into a changing underworld, an old age lived quietly in the suburbs, at least on the surface, and a final journey on a late summer morning from which he never returned. What remained to be explored was how investigators, journalists, and historians pieced together those outlines into a coherent narrative. What they knew, what they could only infer, and how his case fit into the broader arc of organized crime's rise and partial retreat in Chicago. In the years after Anthony "Little Tony" Zizzo disappeared, the work of explaining who he had been fell largely to people who had never met him. Investigators sorting through old files, journalists combing archives, and historians trying to make sense of a clandestine world from fragments. Unlike political figures or corporate executives, men in Zizzo's position did not leave behind public speeches, memoirs, or carefully curated paper trails. What survives instead are terse mentions in police reports, surveillance summaries, court dockets, and the occasional stray line in a newspaper story. From that dry material, a picture of a life and of the era that shaped it has to be assembled piece by piece. Much of what is known about Zizzo's long career rests on the internal paperwork of law enforcement. In the 1950s and 1960s, as the FBI slowly accepted that organized crime was not a series of isolated local gangs, but a national phenomenon, agents in Chicago began maintaining systematic files on those they regarded as key outfit figures and rising associates. These documents, now partially available through court exhibits and, in some cases, Freedom of Information Act requests, rarely read like dramatic prose. Instead, they might note in the understated language of bureaucracy that subject Anthony Zizzo observed leaving 23rd and Cicero location in company of known gambling figure, or that Zizzo believed to be associated with crew operating in Cicero area under direction of redacted. Individually, such notations reveal little. Collectively, across years and then decades, they trace patterns. Who met whom, which businesses served as recurring meeting spots, how often certain names appear together. For historians of organized crime, these patterns are invaluable. They do not prove, by themselves, that Zizzo held a particular title on a precise date, but they do show that federal agents, based on consistent observation and confidential sources, believed he functioned as a trusted intermediary in the outfit's western suburban operations. These same files help explain why, by the 1970s, Zizzo's name had become a fixture in the background of major Chicago area investigations, even when he was not the person facing charges. When strike forces targeted illegal casinos, sports betting rings, or extortion schemes in Cicero and nearby suburbs, agents would note not only the immediate operators, but also the more senior figures they believed were ultimately in charge. In some cases, those higher-ups could be tied directly to specific acts, leading to indictments. In others, the evidence remained circumstantial or reliant on informants whose credibility would be difficult to defend in court. Zizzo often fell into the latter category, someone whose presence at key locations and whose associations pointed to influence, but against whom prosecutors struggled to build airtight cases, until Nevada. The federal racketeering case that eventually sent him to prison in the 1990s did not originate in a Chicago back room but in the desert, where the outfit and other Midwestern crime families had long pursued lucrative opportunities. Las Vegas, by then, was no longer the mob-dominated frontier it had been in the 1950s and 1960s, when syndicate-linked investors helped build casinos and skimmed cash before it ever hit the books. By the late 20th century, gaming corporations overseen by regulators and traded on stock exchanges dominated the Strip. But around the edges, in illegal bookmakers' operations, private betting parlors, and schemes preying on gamblers who fell into deep debt, organized crime influence persisted. According to court records and contemporary reporting, federal investigators in Nevada spent years mapping one such network. Wiretaps, financial records, and cooperating witnesses pointed to a sports betting and debt collection operation that, they alleged, drew support and direction from outfit figures in Chicago. When indictments were handed down, Anthony Zizzo's name appeared among the defendants. The charges, framed under RICO and related statutes, accused the group of conducting an illegal gambling business and using threats and intimidation to collect on unpaid betting debts. The government's theory was that this was not a series of isolated strong-arm incidents, but part of an organized system that funneled money back to Midwestern syndicates. Faced with the evidence amassed, taped conversations, witness accounts, and paper trails, Zizzo chose a path that many organized crime defendants have taken over the years. Rather than contest every allegation at trial, he entered a guilty plea to a racketeering-related charge, acknowledging his role in the conspiracy. The plea spared the government the risks and expense of a full trial, and it allowed him to accept a fixed sentence rather than gamble on a potentially harsher outcome if a jury convicted him on all counts. Public records indicate that he received several years in federal prison, a serious punishment for a man whose previous encounters with the law had resulted in comparatively lesser consequences. For prosecutors, the conviction marked an important milestone, a figure long regarded in confidential memos as a Cicero power, finally appearing on the public record as a racketeering felon. For students of organized crime history, it also stands out because it is one of the few points in Zizzo's life where allegation intersects definitively with adjudicated fact. While FBI files and Crime Commission reports can describe him as a reputed or alleged outfit leader, the Nevada case is the rare instance where his own admission in court links him directly to an organized criminal enterprise. The Bureau of Prisons records, though limited in detail, confirm his time in federal custody. They show his sentence, his projected release date, and the institution where he was housed. Beyond that, little is publicly documented about his years behind bars, but the broader history of mob-related inmates in the federal system offers some context. Organized crime figures often found themselves grouped, formally or informally, with others from similar backgrounds. Some used their time to maintain connections, passing messages through lawyers or visiting relatives. Others withdrew, keeping their heads down to avoid new trouble. Crucially, there is no public indication that Zizzo cooperated with authorities during or after his Nevada case. Unlike Nicholas Calabrese or other high-profile turncoats, his name never appeared on witness lists as a government informant. That refusal to cooperate likely reinforced, in the eyes of those within the outfit, an image of him as someone who adhered to the code of silence that had long governed the organization. It may also have contributed to the government's later portrayal of him as a hardened insider, someone who, having endured serious federal charges without turning state's evidence, returned to Chicago with his standing intact or even enhanced. When he emerged from prison, and agents soon began noting his presence again in the company of known outfit figures, the narrative inside law enforcement became clear. Far from being a retired relic, he was believed to have resumed an active role in the organization's administration. For journalists and historians trying to understand his place within that structure, a second major body of sources has proven important: the work of watchdog organizations like the Chicago Crime Commission. Established long before Zizzo's birth to fight municipal and organized corruption, the commission spent much of the 20th century tracking the outfit's evolution. It published periodic reports listing suspected mob figures, describing their known or alleged roles, and mapping the shifting leadership. These reports, based on a mixture of public records, law enforcement cooperation, and the Commission's own research, frequently named Anthony "Little Tony" Zizzo as a key Cicero operative beginning in the 1980s and continuing into the 2000s. In one widely cited organizational chart released in the early 21st century, the Commission placed Zizzo near the top of the outfit's hierarchy in the western suburbs, beneath an overall boss, but above crew leaders and street-level operatives. The chart did not carry the force of law, and its authors were careful to note that such diagrams represented their best assessment based on available information, not definitive proof. Still, for the public and for students of crime history, these visual representations made concrete what had previously been buried in reams of classified reports: that federal and civic investigators alike viewed Zizzo as more than a peripheral associate. Newspaper archives reinforce this picture. In the 1970s and 1980s, his name appeared only sporadically, often in passing, in stories about raids or indictments that focused on more notorious figures. By the 1990s and early 2000s, however, he was increasingly mentioned in connection with broader analyses of the outfit's changing leadership. Articles in the Chicago Tribune, Sun-Times, and other outlets referred to him as a reputed Cicero boss, or alleged underboss, language reflecting both the seriousness with which investigators regarded him and the legal caution required when discussing someone who had not been convicted of specific acts beyond the Nevada case. These stories often drew on unnamed law enforcement sources, who painted a picture of a man who preferred to avoid attention, handling matters quietly, and without the flamboyance that had brought down some of his predecessors. At the same time, academic studies of organized crime in Chicago, while less focused on particular individuals, used cases like his to illustrate broader themes. Scholars noted how the outfit had, over decades, shifted from a highly visible presence with open gambling halls and showpiece nightclubs to a more discreet web of relationships embedded in otherwise legitimate businesses and local governments. Figures like Zizzo, who operated in the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st, were products of that adaptation. They were less likely to own nightclubs reminiscent of the Capone era and more likely to be involved in back-end arrangements, silent partnerships, consulting, roles, and influence over who got certain contracts or licenses. This shift had social consequences that are still being debated. On one hand, the lack of open gun battles and sensational headlines led some to believe that the mob had been taken care of, a relic of the past. On the other hand, the outfit's quieter presence in real estate, construction, waste hauling, and local politics meant that its impact on ordinary citizens could be both more diffuse and more insidious. Corrupt awarding of contracts could raise costs for taxpayers. Infiltration of unions could jeopardize workers' pensions. Predatory lending and gambling schemes could drain the savings of families who never saw themselves as part of a criminal underworld. In this environment, an unobtrusive figure like Zizzo could, according to investigators, wield significant influence without ever becoming a household name. The contrast between that behind-the-scenes power and the modest appearance of his Westmont life has fascinated many who have tried to tell his story. Neighbors remembered a small, older man who minded his own business, not a figure whose name appeared in conjunction with some of the most significant mob cases of his era. This dissonance underscores a broader point about the sociology of organized crime in late 20th century America. Its leaders learned that survival depended on blending into the mainstream. Flashy cars, expensive suits, and nightclub ownership had become liabilities, signaling income that tax authorities could probe and lifestyles that attracted media scrutiny. A quiet house on a tree-lined suburban street, by contrast, attracted little notice. When, after his disappearance, television documentaries and long-form articles revisited his life, they were forced to bridge that gap between perception and allegation. Producers and writers drew on the same pool of material: FBI affidavits, crime commission charts, court transcripts from the Nevada case and the family secrets trial, and interviews with retired agents and prosecutors. In some cases, they were able to include on-camera comments from law enforcement veterans who had trailed Zizzo for years, men and women who spoke, in measured tones, about their belief that he had been one of the last of a particular generation of outfit leaders. They emphasized not only the crimes they associated with him, but also the discipline with which he had maintained his low profile. Yet those storytellers also had to confront the limits of what could honestly be said. Unlike the Central Family Secrets defendants, whose participation in specific murders and extortion schemes was laid out in detail at trial, Zizzo's alleged activities remained, for the most part, in the realm of intelligence rather than adjudicated fact. Responsible accounts, therefore, framed assertions about his rank and role as what they were: law enforcement assessments, not judicial findings. The line between allegation and proof mattered not only legally, but historically. Overstating certainty risks turning a complex, partially known life into a simple caricature. Understating it, on the other hand, can obscure patterns that institutions with long memories and access to non-public sources considered credible. Within that tension, one theme consistently emerged: the idea of loyalty and its costs. To the extent that he can be read through the available record, Zizzo appears as a man who, once he entered the outfit's orbit, did not step away, even after a serious prison term, even into his 70s. His refusal to cooperate in the Nevada case aligned with long-standing underworld norms that rewarded silence and punished betrayal. It also placed him firmly on one side of a line that, during the family secrets era, others were crossing. When Nicholas Calabrese and other insiders chose to testify, they shattered many of the myths of unbreakable loyalty that had protected the outfit for decades. The contrast with Ziz, another aging mob figure, but one who vanished rather than appear in a witness box, was not lost on observers. In the Chicago law enforcement community, his disappearance became a touchstone in conversations about what, despite all the successes of the 1990s and 2000s, remained unknowable. Agents retiring from the organized crime squad in those years spoke of his case as unfinished business. Younger investigators inherited not only boxes of files, but also oral histories, recollections of surveillance operations, off-the-record comments from informants, and gut instincts about which unsolved crimes might be connected beneath the surface. They also inherited the practical constraints that had limited their predecessors. Without a body, without a confession, without reliable direct witnesses, they were left with, at best, a strong suspicion that internal outfit dynamics lay behind his disappearance, and little prospect of turning that suspicion into a prosecutable case. Meanwhile, Zizzo's name continued to surface intermittently in connection with other investigations, not because he was a target, he was gone, but because his presumed role helped explain past events. When prosecutors or authors described the outfit's structure during certain decades, they included him as one of several key figures overseeing Cicero. When journalists traced the decline of traditional mob influence in Chicago, they pointed out that many of the men most identified with that era, including Zizzo, were now dead, imprisoned, or missing. His unsolved case thus became part of a larger narrative of transition, the fatting of an old guard whose roots reached back to the mid-century heyday of the syndicate. The cumulative effect of all this documentation is not to resolve every question about Anthony "Little Tony" Zizzo's life, but to place him within a clear historical frame. He was not an isolated outlaw or a rogue operator acting on his own whims. He was, by all available evidence, part of a structured organization that had, from the time of his childhood, exerted a powerful and often harmful influence on parts of Chicago and its suburbs. His trajectory, from Italian-American neighborhoods shaped by Prohibition's aftermath, through decades in Cicero's shadows, to a quiet late-life suburb where old patterns likely continued beneath a veneer of normalcy, tracks closely with the trajectory of the outfit itself as it adapted to new laws, new economic realities, and new expectations of secrecy. At the same time, the gaps in his story are a reminder of the limits of any attempt to fully map a clandestine network. For every surveillance report that captured a meeting in a parking lot, there were others that agents missed. For every informant who named him as a key figure, there were conversations conducted only among men who never cooperated. His own voice, except in the carefully constrained setting of a criminal plea, is almost entirely absent from the record. That silence, partly chosen, partly imposed by the circumstances of his disappearance, forces anyone telling his story to acknowledge not only what can be documented, but also what must remain, for now, in the realm of informed but unprovable inference. As the first wave of headlines about Anthony "Little Tony" Zizzo's disappearance faded in the late 2000s, what remained was a quieter, more methodical effort to understand his place in the long history of the Chicago outfit, and to determine, if possible, what had happened to him. The FBI kept his case open, listing him as a missing person who was presumed to have met with foul play. Periodically, agents renewed public appeals for information, reminding the public that a reward remained on offer, and that they believed his disappearance was connected in some way to organized crime. Each reminder brought a brief flurry of coverage, usually recycling the basic outline of his story. Reputed Cicero boss, federal felon, 71 years old, last seen leaving his Westmont home in a silver Jeep. Behind the scenes, the investigation was woven into the broader tapestry of the Bureau's long struggle with the outfit. Detectives and agents who had cut their teeth on earlier mob cases reviewed old informant reports, looking for hints of past grievances or internal disputes that might have resurfaced. They revisited surveillance logs from the months leading up to August 2006, tracing the locations Zizzo had frequented and the men he had met. Some of those associates were themselves subjects of active inquiries. Others were interviewed formally or informally about when they had last seen him and whether they had heard anything about his fate. As in most organized crime investigations, responses were cautious and often unhelpful. Even when individuals were not personally implicated, the lifelong habit of saying as little as possible about outfit business remained strong. The lack of concrete progress in his case did not mean that law enforcement lacked context. On the contrary, by the time Zizzo vanished, federal agents and prosecutors possessed a detailed, if incomplete, portrait of the world he had inhabited for decades. That portrait was built not only from files about him personally, but from a vast archive of material about Cicero and the western suburbs, where the outfit had entrenched itself to a degree that made the area a byword among specialists for municipal capture by organized crime. To understand the kind of system in which Zizzo rose, it is useful to step back and look at Cicero over the second half of the 20th century. Long before his name appeared in reports, the town had earned a reputation as a haven for Capone-era operations. In the 1920s, Capone and his allies had shifted much of their gambling and liquor business just beyond Chicago's borders to escape pressure from reform-minded city officials. There, in Cicero's bars, brothels, and back rooms, They cultivated relationships with local politicians and police officers that allowed illegal enterprises to flourish with relatively little interference. That pattern of official tolerance or outright collusion in exchange for money and political support did not disappear with the end of Prohibition. Instead, as the outfit evolved, Cicero remained one of its primary strongholds. By the time Zizzo was a young man in the 1950s and 1960s, federal and state investigators already viewed the town as a crucial node in the syndicate's gambling and loan sharking network. Illegal casinos and high-stakes card rooms operated in or near Cicero's commercial strips. Sports bettors and bar owners knew that certain figures, often Italian-American men with no formal public positions but obvious influence, served as the real power behind some local enterprises. Over the decades that followed, those operations diversified. Court cases and investigative reporting from the 1970s through the early 2000s describe a pattern in which the outfit, often through intermediaries, inserted itself into legitimate-seeming businesses that could generate steady revenue and, in many cases, leverage over public institutions. Waste hauling companies that received municipal contracts, insurance brokers who handled town policies, construction firms that won bids on public works projects, and liquor-licensed establishments where gambling machines quietly proliferated all appeared, at various points, in prosecutors' narratives of how organized crime monetized its influence in Cicero. One of the most telling windows into this system came not from a classic mob trial, but from a municipal corruption case in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Federal prosecutors charged Cicero's town president, Betty Lauren Maltese, and several co-defendants with looting the municipality through a fraudulent insurance scheme. The case, built on financial records and testimony from insiders, alleged that what appeared to be legitimate insurance and benefits contracts were, in fact, vehicles for siphoning millions of dollars out of the town's coffers. Among Lauren Maltese's co-defendants were men that investigators described as having long-standing ties to the outfit. While Anthony Zizzo was not charged in that case, its details echoed patterns that had defined Cicero's relationship with organized crime for decades. Public offices steered business to favored vendors, who in turn shared the proceeds with silent partners and criminal allies. It was in this environment, where the boundaries between municipal government, legitimate business, and illicit syndicate were blurred, that Zizzo was believed to operate. Law enforcement assessments portraying him as a Cicero, street boss, or underboss did not suggest that he personally orchestrated every scheme. Rather, they cast him as one of the men who managed the outfit's overall interests in the area. This would have included overseeing illegal gambling dens and sports betting networks, ensuring that bar owners hosting video poker machines paid their obligations, resolving disputes among lower-level associates, and maintaining relationships with intermediaries who could influence local policy. The specific mechanics of these operations varied by industry. In the world of gambling, the outfit's presence often took the form of credit and collection. Bookmakers who handled wagers on sporting events could turn to syndicate figures for backing when their losses outran their reserves. In return, they surrendered a cut of their profits and, in some cases, ceded the right to decide when to extend credit and how to respond to customers who failed to pay. In the area of video poker and other devices, the outfit's role was frequently to secure a foothold in profitable locations, bars, social clubs, restaurants, by providing machines, arranging service, and enforcing exclusive agreements. When bar owners fell behind on payments or considered switching to rival suppliers, the knowledge that they were dealing with men identified in whispers as mob-connected served as a powerful deterrent. In the realm of public contracts and labor, the mechanisms were subtler but no less consequential. Outfit-influenced businesses might underbid competitors with the expectation that they could recoup profits through padded invoices, substandard materials, or side deals. Unions whose locals were infiltrated or controlled by syndicate figures might steer work to companies that paid kickbacks or allowed ghost employees on their payrolls. Workers, in such cases, could find their pension funds endangered by risky or self-dealing investments. Taxpayers, meanwhile, paid more for less, even if they never knew the reason. Anthony Zizzo's name appears in this web not because he was personally identified in each of these arrangements. He was not, but because investigators consistently placed him near the top of the local hierarchy that, in their analysis, made such schemes possible. When one looks across the mass of FBI reports, Chicago Crime Commission charts, and court filings that touch on Cicero's underworld during the last quarter of the 20th century, he emerges as a recurring presence, present at key meetings, associated with major figures, and described by informants as someone whose approval carried weight. This vantage point, if accurately reflected in those sources, would have given him a front-row view of the outfit's adaptation to changing times. By the 1980s and 1990s, the days when mob figures could rely on near-total protection from local authorities were fading. Reform campaigns, investigative journalism, and the steady grinding of federal prosecutions had made it harder for gross abuses to remain hidden indefinitely. Town officials who once might have assumed they could count on the same impunity as their predecessors now faced auditors, inspectors general, and watchdog groups. The result was not the end of corruption, but a more cautious and sophisticated approach. Paper trails were buried under layers of shell companies. Decision-making was fragmented across committees and boards. Illegal cash was laundered through more complex financial structures. In this climate, the outfit's reliance on discretion became even more pronounced. The flamboyant performances that had once defined certain gangland figures, the expensive suits, the high-profile nightclub appearances, the ostentatious cars, were increasingly seen as liabilities. A man like Zizzo, described by neighbors as unremarkable in dress and demeanor, fit the new mold. Someone who could attend a meeting in a plain restaurant, drive home to a modest house, and leave few obvious traces for casual observers to follow. At the same time, the social context of Italian-American life in the Chicago area was changing. By the late 20th century, the vast majority of Italian-American families had long since left the cramped tenements and insular enclaves of earlier decades. They had moved to suburbs, entered diverse professions, and integrated into the broader middle class. Italian-American organizations, from fraternal societies to professional associations, were vocal in condemning the continued tendency to equate their heritage with organized crime. They pointed out, accurately, that only a tiny fraction of Italian Americans had ever been involved in the outfit or similar groups, and that many had been its victims, as small business owners shaken down for protection, as workers whose unions were corrupted, or as citizens living in towns whose governments were plundered. Zizzo's story, in this sense, sits at an uncomfortable intersection between community pride and historical reality. On one hand, he stands as an example of how, for some men of his generation, the path to influence and wealth seemed to run through the outfit's structures. On the other hand, the persistence of his case in public discourse risks overshadowing the far more common stories of Italian-American families who pursued education, legitimate enterprise, and civic engagement. Responsible historical accounts, therefore, situate his life not as emblematic of an ethnic group, but as illustrative of how a specific criminal organization recruited and retained certain individuals over time. The law enforcement responses to that organization over Zizzo's lifetime also evolved dramatically. In his youth, during the post-Capone years, federal attention to organized crime was inconsistent. Local alliances and corruption often blunted investigations. By the time he was an experienced operative, in the 1960s and 1970s, Congress had armed prosecutors with RICO and related statutes, and the FBI had established dedicated squads tasked with understanding organized crime as a system rather than as a series of isolated incidents. Wiretaps, hidden microphones, and long-term surveillance operations became standard tools. The Nevada case that ensnared him in the 1990s would have been difficult to assemble without the ability to monitor financial flows across state lines and to use cooperating witnesses under the protective umbrella of witness security programs. The family secrets investigation and trial, unfolding in the years immediately before and after his disappearance, represented a culmination of these techniques. The government's ability to persuade Nicholas Calabrese and other insiders to testify, to corroborate their accounts with forensic evidence, and to present a coherent picture of decades of outfit activity reflected both institutional persistence and changing norms. Once, the prospect of a made member breaking the code of silence had seemed almost unthinkable. By the early 2000s, the combination of long potential sentences, aging defendants, and the availability of protection for cooperating witnesses had altered the calculus for some participants. Zizzo's trajectory, by contrast, reflects the older model, someone who, insofar as the public record shows, never took the step of formal cooperation. That choice may have preserved his status within the outfit up to a point, but it did not guarantee his safety. In tightly knit criminal organizations, loyalties can be overshadowed by perceived risks, and decisions about how to deal with those risks are often made by small circles of men under pressure. While there is no publicly available evidence pinpointing who made what decisions about Zizzo in 2006, the pattern of similar cases in organized crime history, where high-ranking members disappeared at moments of tension, looms large in investigators' thinking. As the 2010s progressed, the outfit itself continued to exist, but in a diminished and altered form. New federal and state cases targeted residual gambling operations, extortion schemes, and attempts to manipulate local unions. Younger figures with ties to older families surfaced in indictments, suggesting that at least some attempt at generational continuity was underway. Yet the scale and brazenness of these activities were far reduced from the mid-century peak. Public officials in suburbs once synonymous with mob influence faced tighter scrutiny, and voters, increasingly diverse and less connected to the old ethnic political machines, were sometimes more willing to support reform candidates. Within this broader narrative of decline and adaptation, Anthony "Little Tony" Zizzo's story assumed a symbolic weight. To those in law enforcement, he represented a link between eras. A man who had come of age when the outfit's power in places like Cicero was at its height, who had navigated the transition into a more discreet and financially sophisticated mode of operation, and whose unexplained disappearance underscored that, even in the 21st century, the organization retained the capacity to enforce its own rules in ways that left few traces for the courts. To the public, his case became one of several reminders that, beneath the surface of an ordinary metropolitan landscape, of chain restaurants, subdivisions, and strip malls, there remained layers of history that did not fit comfortably into tourist brochures or boosterish narratives. A silver Jeep abandoned in a Melrose Park parking lot linked, in the minds of those who followed such stories, to a lineage stretching back through Las Vegas skimming, Cicero's corrupt contracts, and ultimately Prohibition-era rackets. The continuity did not reside in specific individuals or methods so much as in institutional habits. The pursuit of illicit profit, the cultivation of corrupt alliances, and the use of fear, sometimes explicit, sometimes merely implied, to keep those arrangements intact. At the same time, the incompleteness of what is known about his fate stands as a reminder of the limits of historical reconstruction when dealing with secretive organizations. Even as archives open and court records accumulate, certain decisions are never documented in ways outsiders can access. Conversations held in parked cars or whispered in back rooms leave no paper trail. Those who participated in them may die, go to prison, or choose never to speak. In Zizzo's case, that silence has so far proved impenetrable. What can be traced with some confidence is the arc of his life within the outfit and the environment that sustained that role. What remains elusive are the final hours of August 31, 2006, and the immediate motives and actors behind his disappearance. As the years since that day lengthen, the balance between what is known and what is conjectured grows more firmly set. His family continues to live with unanswered questions. Law enforcement agencies keep his file open, but the likelihood of a dramatic breakthrough diminishes with time. Historians and journalists incorporate his story into larger accounts of Chicago's underworld, acknowledging both the substantial evidence of his role in the outfit and the unresolved nature of his end. In that sense, Anthony "Little Tony" Zizzo occupies a peculiar place in the history of American organized crime. Not the most infamous figure of his generation, but one whose life and disappearance capture, in concentrated form, the endurance, adaptation, and opacity of a syndicate that shaped parts of a great city for nearly a century. By the time a new decade began after Anthony "Little Tony" Zizzo's disappearance, his name had settled into a particular niche in the memory of those who had spent years watching Chicago's underworld. For retired FBI agents and prosecutors who came of age in the 1970s and 1980s, he represented one of the last bridges between the outfit they had first studied, dominated by men like Tony Accardo, Joey Ayuppa, and Jackie Saron, and the quieter, more cautious syndicate that had survived into the early 21st century. In briefing rooms and law enforcement conferences, his story appeared not as a headline or a case study in courtroom strategy, but as an example used to illustrate the enduring gap between intelligence and evidence, between what investigators were convinced had happened and what they could actually prove. It is in that gap that much of the latter part of his historical footprint now rests. Over years of investigations, federal and local agencies had built a deep reservoir of intelligence on Zizzo. Sightings logged in surveillance notes, informants, reports that placed him at the center of Cicero operations, intercepted conversations in which others referred to him with respect and a certain wariness. In aggregate, this material convinced generations of organized crime specialists that he had indeed held the roles they publicly attributed to him. Cicero, street boss, outfit underboss, trusted lieutenant to James Marcello. Yet when it came time to translate such assessments into courtroom charges after his Nevada conviction, prosecutors never brought a comprehensive Chicago-based case against him. The reasons were practical rather than sentimental. Intelligence is often suggestive and cumulative. Prosecutions, by contrast, depend on specific acts that can be tied to a defendant beyond a reasonable doubt. The family secrets case, which concluded with convictions in 2007 and sent several top outfit leaders to prison for the rest of their lives, starkly illustrated the difference. There, prosecutors had something unprecedented in Chicago mob history: a fully initiated member willing to testify in detail about murders, meetings, and internal discipline. Nicholas Calabrese described under oath how he had been recruited, how he had participated in killings, and how orders flowed from the outfit's upper ranks. His accounts of long unsolved homicides, like the killing of the Spilatro brothers in 1986, or the assassination of Union steward and teamster Anthony, Tony the Ant Spilatro himself, were backed by physical evidence, old investigative files, and other witnesses. Zizzo's name surfaced in that trial not in connection with any particular killing, but in prosecutors' explanations of how the outfit's leadership was structured in later years. When they told jurors that James Marcello did not personally oversee every card game or loan sharking collection, they added that men like Anthony Zizzo filled the intermediary roles that made the system work. Cooperating witnesses and FBI agents, acknowledged that they did not have tapes of him ordering violence or personally collecting an extortion payment, but they asserted that his position in the hierarchy was well known within outfit circles. In the courtroom, those assertions were part of a larger effort to demonstrate the organization's continuity into the 1990s and early 2000s. Outside, for historians, they added another layer to the accumulated record, placing him near the center of Cicero's underworld. At the same time, the family secrets trial highlighted the tensions and dangers that come with insiders breaking the code of silence. The very fact that Nicholas Calabrese, by all accounts a seasoned and previously trusted soldier, had chosen to cooperate underlined for remaining outfit members that no one could be assumed permanently loyal when facing the possibility of life in prison. Frank Calabrese Jr.'s decision to wear a hidden recorder while talking with his father in prison further sharpened that realization. Betrayal could come not only from longtime associates, but from one's own family. In such an atmosphere, every senior figure who had deep knowledge of past crimes and current structures became, in theory, a potential threat. It is in this context that some investigators have placed Zizzo's disappearance, though they have been careful in public to distinguish between inference and proof. On the one hand, federal officials repeatedly said there was no indication he had agreed to cooperate in the family secrets case, and he was not charged in that indictment. On the other hand, they knew that the case's success would likely spur follow-up investigations targeting remaining outfit operations, including those in Cicero. A man of Zizzo's seniority would have been one of the few people with detailed knowledge of long-standing financial and political arrangements, making him someone whose choices, whether to stay silent, to resist, or to inform, would matter greatly to others. The parallel with other high-profile disappearances in organized crime history is difficult to ignore. Jimmy Hoffa's vanishing in 1975, though involving a different organization and context, set a template in the public imagination. A powerful insider goes to a meeting and is never seen again. A car is found but yields no clear forensic solution. Theories proliferate while evidence remains elusive. In Chicago and elsewhere, similar patterns have marked the ends of various underworld figures who were thought to be vulnerable to law enforcement pressure or internal suspicion. In these cases, the absence itself becomes a kind of sign, interpreted by those familiar with the underworld as a deliberate message, that certain knowledge can be made to disappear along with its possessor. Yet for historians committed to grounding their work in verifiable facts, it is essential to separate resonance from certainty. Unlike the family secrets murders, which were reconstructed in court with dates, locations, and participants, the circumstances of August 31, 2006, remain shadowed. There is no confession, no cooperating witness describing that day's events, no forensic scene establishing where or how any harm occurred. What can be said with confidence is narrower, that a man long identified as a key figure in the outfit vanished, that his car was found abandoned, that he was never heard from again, and that investigators with deep knowledge of organized crime patterns believe his disappearance was likely connected in some way to that world. Beyond that, any assignment of specific motives or perpetrators moves from history into hypothesis. In the 2010s, as academic interest in organized crime increasingly turned toward transnational networks, cyber-enabled fraud, and global money laundering, the Chicago outfit and figures like Zizzo nonetheless retained a hold on scholars and the public as examples of how older, territorially based syndicates evolved within a single metropolitan region. Conferences on criminal justice and urban history featured panels that revisited the outfit not out of nostalgia, but to analyze its long-term social and institutional impact. Researchers examining patterns of public corruption in the Midwest could scarcely ignore Cicero and the western suburbs, where the entanglement of town halls and racketeers had been documented across multiple generations. In those discussions, Anthony Zizzo's career often surfaced as a case study in embedded criminality, the way a figure can occupy a central place in illicit structures without occupying any formal public office. He signed no municipal ordinances, ran for no elective post, and headed no visible corporate empire. Yet, if law enforcement assessments are correct, his influence touched how illegal gambling functioned, how certain debts were enforced, and indirectly, how money flowed through businesses that interacted with local government. This form of influence is both harder to detect and harder to eradicate than older models where criminals also openly held civic positions. Removing a corrupt mayor changes the nameplate on an office door. Dismantling an informal network of influence rooted in decades of personal relationships requires a different kind of effort. From the vantage point of communities in the western suburbs, that effort has taken various forms. Some reforms have come from above: state-level oversight of municipal finances, stricter bidding procedures for public contracts, and closer auditing of pension and insurance schemes. Others have come from within: local residents organizing for greater transparency, journalists at regional papers and television stations investigating suspicious land deals or licensing decisions, and civic groups pressuring officials to distance themselves from individuals widely reputed to be mob-connected. The decline of older ethnic political machines, driven partly by demographic change and partly by disillusionment with patronage and cronyism, also altered the environment in which outfit figures had once thrived. Within Italian-American circles, the conversation took on a different emphasis. Community leaders and scholars worked to decouple cultural identity from underworld mythology, pointing out that fixation on figures like Zizzo, however historically understandable, risked reinforcing stereotypes that had long been used to marginalize Italian Americans. They emphasized the disproportionate attention given to a small set of criminals compared with the millions of ordinary families whose histories were those of construction workers, teachers, doctors, shop owners, and public servants. At the same time, some acknowledged that facing the full record of organized crime's impact, including how it exploited and damaged Italian-American neighborhoods as much as any others, was preferable to either denial or glamorization. Popular culture, for its part, continued to mine Chicago's mob history for stories, documentaries, and podcast episodes. In many of these treatments, Zizzo figured not as the main subject, but as part of the supporting cast in the outfit's late 20th century chapters. Producers used his case to illustrate the persistence of old patterns into a supposedly more law-abiding era. A man who looked like any other elderly suburban neighbor yet was described, in sober tones by retired agents, as a significant underworld presence. Visuals juxtaposed his missing person photograph with archival images of earlier mobsters, inviting viewers to see continuity where, in reality, much had changed. The scale of illegal operations, the degree of political protection, and the public's tolerance for open vice. For law enforcement professionals, the lessons drawn from his story tended to be technical rather than cinematic. Training materials and informal discussions emphasized the importance of long-term intelligence collection, the careful evaluation of informant reliability, and the challenges of building prosecutable cases from complex, often decades-old conspiracies. Zizzo's Nevada conviction, secured with the help of wiretaps and cooperating witnesses, was contrasted with the absence of comparable evidence tying him to specific acts in Chicago that could hold up in court. His disappearance, unsolved even after years of investigative attention, was cited as a cautionary tale about how quickly potential witnesses or subjects can be removed from reach in tightly controlled criminal environments. One recurring point of reflection was the shifting calculus of cooperation. In earlier generations, the prospect of entering a witness protection program, adopting a new identity, and leaving behind one's community was often seen by insiders as nearly unthinkable, not only because of fear of retaliation, but because of cultural norms that placed a premium on loyalty and rootedness. By the time of the family secrets case, however, the combination of aging defendants, long federal sentences, and a more elaborated system of witness security had changed that calculation for some. Frank Calabrese, Jr., described in his memoirs and testimonies the agonizing choice to turn against his own father. Nicholas Calabrese spoke of wrestling with guilt and fear before agreeing to testify. Anthony Zizzo belongs firmly, in the slim public record of his decisions, to the older tradition. Confronted with serious federal charges in Nevada, he chose to plead guilty, but did not, as far as any available information suggests, provide cooperation against others. Whether that choice directly affected his fate later is something that, absent insider testimony, cannot be known. It did, however, shape how both law enforcement and the outfit likely perceived him. To the former, as a hardened and committed member of a criminal organization. To the latter, as someone who had, at least through that case, proven his adherence to the code of silence. As years passed with no resolution of his disappearance, new pieces of tangential information occasionally surfaced, but stopped short of a breakthrough. An informant might tell agents that he had heard rumors linking Zizzo's vanishing to a dispute over gambling proceeds, or to fears that he was under renewed scrutiny by federal investigators. Another might mention passing remarks by lower-level associates that suggested unease after he went missing, as if a particular form of stability had been abruptly removed. Each such tidbit was weighed against the others, cross-checked where possible, and added to the still-growing file. But rumors, however persistent, do not constitute proof, and none were backed by the kind of corroboration that could support public charges. The resulting portrait of his final years and disappearance is therefore one of layered but incomplete understanding. On the inner layer lies the outfit's own knowledge of what happened and why, held by a small and shrinking circle of men whose trust in one another was already strained by decades of prosecutions and betrayals. On the outer layers lie the accumulated observations of law enforcement, the analytic reconstructions of historians, and the speculations of journalists and the public. Between these layers remains a silence that, so far, no one has decisively pierced. In the meantime, the Chicago underworld has continued to change. Street gangs, many of them rooted in different neighborhoods and demographics than the old Italian-dominated outfit, now account for much of the city's most visible violence. International drug trafficking organizations use Chicago as a distribution hub, linking it to networks stretching into Mexico, Central and South America, and beyond. Cyber-enabled crimes, identity theft, online fraud, ransomware, have introduced new forms of illicit profit that do not depend on controlling physical territory in the way earlier rackets did. In this shifting landscape, the outfit remains present but no longer occupies the central position in law enforcement priorities that it once did. This does not mean it has vanished. Occasional cases in the 2010s and 2020s have alleged outfit involvement in illegal gambling, extortion, and attempts to influence union locals. The amounts of money involved are smaller than in the heyday of Las Vegas skimming or wide-open Cicero casinos, and the defendants' names, drawn from younger generations and sometimes more ethnically mixed circles, are less familiar to the general public. Yet the institutional memory of agencies like the FBI and the Chicago Crime Commission ensures that the outfit's past remains part of the frame through which present cases are viewed. When a bookmaker in a western suburb is charged with running a large illegal sports betting operation, it is natural for investigators to ask whether he is acting independently or under the auspices of a residual syndicate structure. In that sense, Anthony "Little Tony" Zizzo's story is not simply about one man's trajectory, but about a particular way of organizing crime across time and space. It captures a movement from visible to invisible, from headline-grabbing violence to quieter forms of exploitation, from an era when the names of bosses were widely known to one in which influence operates behind the facade of ordinary suburban life. His childhood in mid-century Italian Chicago, his adulthood in the half-licit world of Cicero's businesses and back rooms, his federal conviction for a multi-state gambling conspiracy, his reemergence as a reputed underboss, and his final, unexplained disappearance together form a kind of arc, a case study in the persistence and partial transformation of organized crime in an American city. What remains to be considered, in looking back over that arc, is how to weigh responsibility and agency in such a world. It is tempting either to reduce men like Zizzo to mere cogs in a larger machine, or, conversely, to depict them as singular villains whose removal would have transformed their communities. The historical record suggests something more complex, that while the outfit as an institution shaped the opportunities and incentives available to those in its orbit, individual choices still mattered. Some young men in Zizzo's neighborhoods chose straight work, education, and civic involvement. A smaller number chose, or were drawn into, the syndicate. Within that smaller group, some broke away or cooperated with authorities. Others, like Zizzo, appear to have stayed the course until circumstances overtook them. It is this mixture of structure and choice, of environment and decision, that makes his life and disappearance more than just a true crime curiosity. For Chicago and its suburbs, the long history of the outfit raises ongoing questions about institutional resilience, community responsibility, and the capacity of law to confront deeply embedded wrongdoing without perpetuating stigmas or overlooking broader social harms. Anthony "Little Tony" Zizzo's story, incomplete though it is, sits squarely at the heart of those questions, offering no simple answers but illustrating, in the concrete details of one man's path, how hard they can be to resolve. In the end, the most enduring image of Anthony "Little Tony" Zizzo may not be the grainy surveillance photographs of him slipping into a Cicero restaurant, or the mug shot taken after his Nevada conviction, but the simple, almost ordinary picture on his missing person flyer. An older man with thinning white hair, serious eyes behind glasses, the lines of age marking his face. That image, circulated by police and the FBI after August 31, 2006, distilled the tension that runs through his story. To some, he was a grandfatherly figure tending his yard in Westmont. To others, he was a longtime outfit power whose decisions affected lives and livelihoods across the western suburbs. Both perceptions grew from the same life, lived across a period when Chicago and its underworld were undergoing profound change. Looking back across that life, one sees how tightly his trajectory was bound to the city's history. Born in 1935 into an Italian-American community still shaped by the aftermath of Prohibition, he grew up at a time when the Chicago outfit was consolidating power out of the flamboyant chaos of the Capone era. As the organization settled into a quieter, more businesslike mode, men like Zizzo found roles for themselves in its supporting structure. First as low-level associates carrying out small tasks, then as trusted intermediaries helping manage gambling, debt collection, and the web of relationships that held the outfit's Cicero realm together. Unlike earlier generations of gangsters who reveled in publicity, he embraced a different model. There were no showy nightclubs with his name attached, no newspaper photographs of him in tailored suits flanked by bodyguards. Law enforcement files instead paint a picture of a man who preferred side doors and short meetings in parking lots, who let others handle overt displays. For years, his significance was visible mainly to those whose job it was to notice. The agents who tracked recurring license plates, the prosecutors who saw his name appear again and again in informant reports, the crime commission researchers who slotted him into organizational charts near the top of the Cicero hierarchy. That low profile did not spare him from the reach of federal law. when he was charged in Nevada in the early 1990s with participating in a racketeering conspiracy tied to illegal bookmaking and debt collection. It marked a turning point. By the time he stood in court to plead guilty, the old assumption that major outfit figures could avoid serious prison time had already been undermined by RICO and the Las Vegas skimming cases. His conviction and sentence showed that even men who rarely appeared in headlines could face substantial consequences when investigators succeeded in documenting their roles in interstate schemes. Yet his prison term did not close the book on his involvement. When he returned to the Chicago area, now an older man settling into a quiet house with his wife, surveillance and informant testimony suggested that his standing inside the outfit remained intact. The code he had followed in Nevada, admitting only to his own conduct and not implicating others, fit the organization's expectations. In the eyes of federal agents who watched him resume contact with known outfit figures, his willingness to absorb punishment without cooperation reinforced the assessment that he was not a peripheral hanger-on but an insider who had chosen his side and intended to stay there. By then, the world around him had changed almost beyond recognition from the one of his youth. The steel mills and stockyards that once sustained working-class Italian neighborhoods had largely vanished. Chicago's population was more diverse, its politics less dominated by old ethnic machines. The outfit itself, battered by decades of prosecutions, had shrunk in size and ambition. No longer did it openly run casinos or aggressively expand into new territories. Instead, it clung to narrower domains where it still had footholds: sports betting, video gambling in bars, certain unions and public contract niches. Cicero, once a near-autonomous fiefdom for mob-connected interests, now faced more oversight and reform pressure, even as vestiges of its troubled past persisted. In that scaled-down environment, someone like Anthony Zizzo became in many ways more, not less, important. Institutional memory matters in any organization. In a criminal one, it can be critical. A man of his generation would have known which bar owners had quietly hosted card games in the 1970s, which contractors had long-standing informal understandings with town officials, which bookmakers could be trusted to handle high-volume clients without losing their nerve. His reported role as a Cicero, street boss, or underboss was not just a title. It implied responsibility for maintaining continuity, ensuring that agreed-upon percentages flowed up the chain, that disputes among lower-level figures were resolved before they drew attention, that the outfit's diminished but still significant interests in the western suburbs remained profitable. At the same time, the legal tools arrayed against him and his peers had never been sharper. Federal prosecutors had learned, often painfully, how to build complex organized crime cases that could withstand appeals. They knew to corroborate informant testimony meticulously, to trace financial flows through shell companies, to use wiretaps sparingly but effectively. Witness protection programs were better established, making cooperation a more realistic option for insiders who decided that silence no longer served them. Against this backdrop, the family secrets case assembled a narrative of outfit activity stretching back to the 1960s and 1970s, focusing in particular on homicides that had long resisted closure. Although Zizzo was not indicted in that case, his name appeared repeatedly in prosecutors' descriptions of how the outfit's administration functioned in more recent years. That dual status, central in law enforcement charts, absent from the defendant's table, placed him in a peculiar position. He was important enough to warrant close scrutiny, but not yet tied to a case that brought him directly back into a federal courtroom. For those who followed such matters, this made his sudden disappearance in August 2006 all the more striking. Here was a man whom agents had long regarded as a key operator still on the street in an era when many of his contemporaries were serving lengthy sentences, gone without leaving a verifiable trace. The absence that began as a police report in Westmont rippled outward, Within weeks, it had become an active FBI investigation, framed from the outset by suspicions of organized crime involvement. Months later, as reporters covering the family secrets trial sought to explain the broader landscape of the outfit, they inevitably mentioned the missing Cicero figure, treating his case as another sign of the syndicate's willingness to enforce its own imperatives outside the formal justice system. Over the years, as no body was found and no one was charged, that suspicion hardened into a kind of working assumption among those familiar with mob history, that whatever happened to him was unlikely to have been random. For his family, however, the story looked very different. Their public statements focused not on organizational charts or old indictments, but on the everyday realities of loss. They described a man who, whatever else he had done in his life, had shared dinners with them, helped around the house, and aged alongside his wife. They spoke of the pain of not knowing, of waking each day without answers, of seeing his name used as a shorthand for a criminal world without corresponding acknowledgement of his role in their private lives. In this, they echoed the experiences of many relatives of organized crime figures, who often find themselves navigating a divide between the legal and journalistic portraits of their loved ones and the personal memories that resist being reduced to a rap sheet. Both sets of perspectives, the institutional and the intimate, are part of the historical record. To focus solely on one is to distort the story. Emphasizing only his family's account risks understating the real harm that the outfit's activities inflicted on individuals, businesses, and civic institutions over decades. Emphasizing only the law enforcement view risks flattening him into a symbol rather than a human being whose choices were made within a specific social and economic context. The challenge for anyone trying to reconstruct his life is to hold both in view: the substantial evidence that he was a central participant in a harmful enterprise, and the understanding that he was also, like anyone else, embedded in relationships and roles that cannot be fully captured in official documents. What his story does make clear is the cumulative impact of organized crime on a city and its suburbs. The outfit's activities over the span of his lifetime were not confined to the stereotypical world of smoky-card rooms and whispered threats. They extended into union halls, municipal budgeting offices, and family-owned bars and restaurants. The money that disappeared from Cicero's treasury in corrupt schemes was money unavailable for schools, infrastructure, or social services. The debts extracted at usurious rates from struggling business owners constrained their ability to hire, invest, or even survive. The quiet sway that syndicate figures held over certain zoning decisions, licensing boards, or contract awards altered development patterns in ways that left lasting marks on neighborhoods. In that sense, the life of Anthony Zizzo, as seen through the lens of historical and investigative records, is less a tale of individual daring than of institutional drag. The outfit's presence acted as a brake on reform efforts, a distorting force in local markets, and a corrosive influence on public trust. Men like him, who dedicated their adult lives to maintaining and profiting from that system, played a role in those harms even if they never personally used a weapon or sat behind a mayor's desk. Their influence lay in orchestration, deciding who collected which debts, which businesses were pressured to host illegal gambling, which subordinates were trusted with sensitive tasks. It is also worth noting what his story does not support. For all the fascination that films, novels, and television series have cultivated around the figure of the mob boss, the real Zizzo, as far as the record reveals, did not live a life of untroubled luxury. He spent years behind bars. He aged under surveillance, knowing that federal agents were documenting his movements and associations. He operated in an environment where long friendships could be clouded by suspicion, once indictments began to fall. The end of his life, to the extent it can be inferred, was not marked by a peaceful retirement, but by an abrupt and unresolved break. Whatever the immediate circumstances of that August day, The final chapter of his story is defined by absence and uncertainty, not triumphant escape. For Chicago and the neighboring communities where he worked, the legacy of the era he represents is mixed. On one hand, the concentrated power that the outfit once wielded has undeniably waned. City and suburban governments are more open to scrutiny, and instances of overt collusion with organized crime are rarer and more likely to provoke public outrage. On the other hand, the patterns that sustain the syndicate, networks of personal loyalty, tolerance for small-scale corruption, the temptation to cut corners for financial gain, have not disappeared. They surface in new forms, tied to different industries and groups, but drawing on similar human weaknesses. In recent years, scholars and civic leaders have argued that one of the most important lessons to draw from stories like Zizzo's is the need to strengthen institutions in ways that do not rely solely on the eventual intervention of law enforcement. Criminal prosecutions can remove individual wrongdoers and, in some cases, break up specific schemes. But the deeper work of building transparent processes, fostering a culture of public service, and creating economic opportunities that reduce the lure of illicit earnings happens over generations. It involves school curricula that teach civic responsibility, journalism that doggedly pursues accountability, and community organizations that insist on fair treatment regardless of political or criminal connections. Against that backdrop, the fascination with the outfit and its figures can be a double-edged sword. On one side, understanding the history of men like Anthony Zizzo can inoculate citizens against naive views of their city's past, revealing how hard won certain reforms have been. On the other, dwelling too long on the mystique of the underworld risks, romanticizing people and practices that, in reality, extracted their gains from the vulnerability and exploitation of others. Responsible accounts therefore aim not to glamorize but to demystify, to show how what might appear from the outside as a life of illicit power often consisted of routine hustles, constant calculations of risk, and ultimately a narrowing circle of trust. Today, Anthony "Little Tony" Zizzo remains officially missing. His name appears in national databases alongside thousands of others whose fates are unresolved. The FBI's offer of a reward for information about his disappearance still stands, a tacit acknowledgement that, even after all this time, a decisive piece of evidence could, in theory, emerge. For his family, each passing year likely brings a deeper acceptance that he will not return, even as questions about the details persist. For law enforcement, his case is a reminder that even the most diligent investigations can leave some stories unfinished. For historians and viewers tracing his path through Chicago's turbulent underworld, his life offers a lens onto nearly 3/4 of a century of change. Through him, one can glimpse the crowded Italian streets of mid-century Chicago, the smoky rooms of Cicero's gambling scene, the sterile corridors of federal courthouses in Nevada, the controlled chaos of the family's secrets trial, and the quiet cul-de-sac in Westmont where, one late summer morning, he told his wife he had a meeting and never came home. Along the way, the tension of his era comes into focus. Between law and lawlessness, between public narratives and private loyalties, between the desire to belong to something powerful and the costs that such belonging can exact. No single biography can capture all the intricacies of a criminal organization that wove itself into the fabric of a major American city. But the outlines of Anthony Zizzo's rise, his steady entrenchment in the outfit, his collision with federal law, and his unresolved disappearance form a story that is both particular and emblematic. It is particular in the sense that his decisions, relationships, and fate were uniquely his own. Emblematic in that they reflect recurring patterns in the history of organized crime, recruitment from marginalized neighborhoods, adaptation to new legal and economic realities, and the use of silence, both chosen and enforced, to shield actions from public view. In the end, what remains are fragments. A birth certificate from 1935, arrest reports, plea agreements, annotated surveillance photographs, family recollections, a missing person bulletin, and the collective memory of a city that has, over generations, learned to live with the knowledge that some of its most consequential stories play out far from the spotlight. Anthony "Little Tony" Zizzo's life unfolded largely in those shadows. Telling it now, as fully and honestly as the record allows, is one way of bringing a measure of light not only to his story, but to the structures and choices that shaped it, and through it, shaped a part of Chicago itself. And as the night settles once more over the silent empires, we step away from the unanswered world of Anthony Zizzo, a story defined not by endings, but by silence. His name remains suspended in shadow, a reminder that in the underworld some stories don't close, they simply fade. If this journey helped you relax or drift towards sleep, remember to like the video, subscribe, and share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. Your support keeps these quiet stories alive. Now let your breathing slow, let the silence surround you, and allow the echoes of mystery to guide you gently into the night. Good night.